Okay, this is the second part of Smashing Prohibition's Objective 1 about the initial problems of Prohibition. And if you flip your page here and go to, let's see, overall it's letter B on the front page, and now we're down to item 3 on the back. This is going to be about how it becomes a big business and leads to organized crime. Now we're going to start with the speakeasy, which in a lot of areas was, well, which in all areas was an illegal underground liquor club. But it had a lot fancier crowd to it than you might expect. To get into a speakeasy, they usually had a door like this, and you'd knock on it very quietly, make sure there were no cops around or anything. In a lot of cases, that wouldn't matter. Cops were in the speakeasies too, but you give a password to get in. You follow a couple of hallways, and you could find yourself a pretty nice party. Now, this looks like it would be a Manhattan club or something like that, but this actually is a speakeasy, probably in a basement somewhere or back in the parts of a warehouse or whatever the case may be. Speakeasies were all over the place, and a lot of times they were pretty fancy, and it included a big change in that women were drinking. That was not something that women did before the 1920s. This kind of speaks into the whole smashing of prohibitions against women. Now, in these clubs, you could find a pretty nice party a lot of the time, and they were really big in the urban areas. But what people don't realize is they were also very big in the rural areas as well. You can see in this picture right here, there's an advertisement in the back for horses, mule, and cattle. This is a rural speakeasy, probably out in the Midwest somewhere, and a lot of times in rural areas, they popped up in old rural shacks or even train cars. Bottom line is that alcohol was available pretty much wherever you wanted to get it. And in order for it to be that way, alcohol became a pretty big business. Take a look at letter C here, the rise of organized crime during Prohibition. It used to be that gangs of thugs would beat people up and extort them for money and things like that, but now with alcohol, it became a much more organized process, run like a business, with presidents and vice presidents, but they went by different names. They were bosses and sergeants and things like that. They'd get involved in a lot of different stuff. Now, it made them a lot of money. They dressed very nicely. But they basically, if you take a look at C1A1, they had organization and accounting and bosses and positions of hierarchy involved in a lot of different areas. You can see them there: prostitution, gambling, narcotics. Even back in the 1920s, they were all involved in those things. And take a look at number 2 here, protection money. Somebody from the mob might come up to you and say that you got to pay them for protection. Protection from who? Well, protection from the mob. If you didn't pay your protection money, they'd blow up your business, or they'd come in with guys and machine guns and mow everything down and destroy it. By 1930, the business was going pretty well, as you can see there. Organized crime bringing in $12 billion to $18 billion in profit, which was more than the U.S. government was collecting at that time. Remember, no major taxes exist during that time, and the federal government's kind of small. But it was also a dangerous business. This is a scene from the St. Valentines Day Massacre in Chicago in 1929, when Al Capone's South Side gang murdered 7 members of his biggest rival's gang, Bugs Moran, expecting Moran to be there, which he wasn't. But murder rates went way up. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre was publicized in the media as one of the most violent crimes ever, and it kind of symbolized the turf war that was going on in Chicago during that time. Chicago itself probably became the leading mob city in America during Prohibition. You would think New York, but really probably Chicago. And as a result, in the 1920s in Chicago, approximately 500 mobsters are going to get murdered. Now, the police often were kind of powerless to do anything about it, except for this guy. This is Elliot Ness, and he led a group called the Untouchables. This is letter C, number 1, and letter C again. Like I said, the cops, back in part 1, the cops were often bribed to look the other way. And in the big business areas of organized crime, they were expected to look the other way on murders. Elliot Ness led this group called the Untouchables, who were called that because they couldn't be bribed. They were above reproach, and in some cases allowed to act above the law. So they were untouchable by the mob and untouchable by the law itself. You may want to jot that down. They were told to do whatever they had to do to get Al Capone, basically. So that meant they could skirt some laws a little bit if they wanted to. It didn't always go real well. Elliot Ness brought a bunch of media reporters in because they had found Al Capone's vault, and when they opened it, there was nothing in there. And the Untouchables never did get Al Capone. Now, if you take a look at C2, we're going to get into the Chicago War a little bit between Capone and Bugs Moran. This is Capone right here. And Capone had moved to Chicago from New York. He had murdered somebody in New York City when he was a teenager and decided it was time to bail out and leave town. Something to jot on the side here about this, actually, Capone's older brother eventually becomes a Prohibition lawman in Oklahoma and actually breaks up a lot of Capone's shipments that were traveling out west. He didn't go by the name Capone, though. He went by the name Two Gun Hart. But that's Capone's brother. Let's get back to Capone for a second here. From 1925 to 1931, he's public enemy #1 in Chicago. Not that people always saw him that way, though. Capone, just to maintain his public image, he saw what the old fictional character Robin Hood had done. Robbing, being a thief, but also taking care of the poor. So Capone is actually beloved by a lot of people in Chicago who received the benefits of his donations and charitable actions, so to speak. In that regard, people liked him quite a bit, as long as you stayed out of his way and didn't get involved in his business. If you did, you could be subject to murders and turf wars, as we saw with the St. Valentines Day Massacre. The problem was that Capone knew this, and so a lot of times he'd be driving around with bulletproof windows and things like that, constantly on the lookout for his life, because there were numerous attempts on his life. He survived it all, and in the end, it wasn't Bugs Moran that got him. It was syphilis, of all things. And it wasn't booze that got him thrown in jail. It was tax evasion. So Capone, when it was all said and done, got 11 years in Alcatraz for tax evasion, eventually got out and retired to Florida. He had contracted, if you're interested in jotting this on the side, it's up to you, but he had contracted syphilis that had spread to his brain, and eventually he dies of brain syphilis and in prison for tax evasion, not murdered or put in prison for alcohol. Something else here of note, if you're interested and you want to jot it on the side, is that Capone had 12 hideouts along the Lake Michigan shoreline in Wisconsin, Illinois, one in Indiana that I know of, and Michigan as well. But here's the most famous thing for us. He had a hideout in Leelanau County. It was in between Glen Lake and Leland, and it had a tower so that if Prohibition agents were coming by boat on Lake Michigan, they could see him coming. Something interesting you may want to jot on the side. Now, his chief enemy in this regard, in the war for Chicago, was Bugs Moran, an Irish guy, who is actually credited with starting the, I guess you'll call it a tradition in America, of the drive-by shooting, which is something he liked to do more than anything else. Now, Capone was actually a little unnerved by Bugs Moran a lot of times because Moran tried so many drive-bys on him, and Capone actually tried to make peace with Moran a bunch of times. Moran would agree to it, and then, shortly thereafter try to kill Capone again, so he never really stuck to it. Moran also never got busted for alcohol-related crimes. He actually dies in prison on a robbery charge. And, of course, a little Michigan history here. One of the gangs that nobody ever really hears about and probably deserves to be publicized was the Purple Gang out of Detroit. And there's a lot of questions about how they got their name. I don't really know how they got their name. But it's mostly a Jewish gang out of Detroit. Capone's was Italian and Bugs Moran's gang was Irish. This is mostly a Jewish gang out of Detroit that may have been the worst of the bunch. They were extremely, excessively violent. They went way over the top in making their points. And even Al Capone decided it was wiser to be allies with them rather than get into a war with them. Capone was a nasty gangster who would murder people, but he got a little unnerved by Bugs Moran, and some people said he was flat out afraid of the Purple Gang out of Detroit. What the Purple Gang would do is they would bring in liquor from Canada, and they would get it to Capone in Chicago, and then that would be sold as Capone's Old Log Cabin brand whiskey, the straight bourbon. If you can see here down the bottom, I don't know if you can read this or not, but it says National Distillers Products Corporation, Peoria, Illinois. So it came out of Chicago, but the Purple Gang kept a lot of those profits for themselves too in the transport. Think about US 31 that runs through Grand Rapids. Capone and the Purple Gang made an agreement that the Purple Gang would be allowed to have anything east in terms of liquor sales and prohibition stuff. They controlled anything east of US 31 running through Grand Rapids, and that Capone could control anything west of US 31. So as a result, Capone just saw it better to work with them than work against them. Now, while the Purple Gang may have been the baddest of the bad, eventually they got sloppy. They got really arrogant in what they did. They had infighting in their group. They started killing each other off. They got very publicly brazen and daring the cops to come get them, which in some cases eventually they did. And their empire, if you want to call it that, basically fell apart by 1931, as most of them were arrested or dead. Okay, that's basically it. We're going to move on to the second objective now. Thanks for listening.